Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Linarco Rodriguez Palestina wash processed Colombia from Manta Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Manta, based out of Nunawading, Australia. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel. As our coffee roaster, I had zero familiarity with going into this review. We picked this coffee up from Airworks as part of their February coffee drop, as I was very excited to see Airworks offering an Australian-based coffee roaster, as we do have a number of Australian-based subscribers, and you guys have been awesome. So I've been pushing Airworks to bring in as many Australian-based coffee roasters as they can. So I was very excited when they finally did bring one in, and I'm certainly looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 50. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a higher extraction one at a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which usually indicates a more medium grind. However, we went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, when Airworks was selling this one to us, they described it as being a traditional Australian roast, which if that's the case, then the traditional Australian roast is on the slightly more developed side of a medium light, as relative to the majority of American-based coffee roasters, I would say that there was a slight bit more development to it, as you can feel an ever so slight smoky quality that was presented within this one. So I think that's kind of the best way to align this one. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 21, first impression through the V60, and the coffee definitely had an interesting start to it, as there are loads of sugary qualities within the coffee and a brighter colored fruit sense to it as well, a lingering brightness that is in line with the listed pear aspect of it as well. And it was in line with the expectations of a pink bourbon coffee in terms of the brightness, so it did have a nice start for the most part. If anything, it was a little bit of a mixed and interesting start, as I felt like this coffee probably needed some time to open up, even though it wasn't necessarily the lightest coffee out there. Day 24 through the Chemex, and the coffee does continue to have that very interesting sugariness and tropicality to it, with a prominent palm fruit brightness yet again. Development was felt a little bit more today, and there's enough intensity to hinder the overall experience in terms of that slightly developed quality. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's to the same extent as maybe some of the Japanese coffees we've also reviewed alongside this one, so I would say still some mixed impressions overall. But we move on to day 27, as we opted for the April brewer, and there were certainly some mixed results, as it did have a fair bit more of a papery quality to this point, where the rest of the coffee felt a little bit more toned down, allowing for a better focus on the sugary aspects of this one. And I'm going to continue to go back to that and highlight that, because this coffee just continuously came out sugary. If I do remember correctly, I believe that Manta uses a Gießen. When I was looking at their website, I did see a photo of a Gießen, so that would make a lot of sense. Plenty of brightness and intensity once again, as the coffee does feel like it's opening up a little bit as it does cool down, and just in general with a bit more time. Day 30, I was actually unsure of which direction to go with this coffee, so I went in a little bit more of a hybrid recipe with lower temperatures and a lower concentration. So I went to 93 Celsius and 17:1, and there was very little success with this coffee, as I felt a little bit more of the developed feel to it and that papery quality yet again, with a very uneven brightness. The sugariness was still abundant. I don't necessarily think that there's anything you can do to take that away from this coffee, but I certainly felt like some adjustments were needed. And I said, you know what, why don't we go in the complete opposite direction? Let's just push this coffee to see what happens. And we did. We went with higher temperatures and a more fine grind to accompany that lower concentration. And weirdly enough, the coffee has greatly improved, as it definitely seemed to mitigate some more of those papery qualities to it, as it's been a bit more present in the aroma of the whole beans themselves. That's what I'm trying to say, is the papery quality was presented within this coffee, not just within the cup itself, but in the grounds, the whole beans of it. It has that sort of aroma to it, but for whatever reason, when we really pushed this coffee, that seemed to be mitigated. A lot of the stronger pear brightness was presented with much more of the sugariness, so the desired aspects of this coffee were much more abundant, and as a result, I felt that it was worth the trade-off of pushing this coffee. Yes, I was feeling the opposite. I wasn't even feeling as much of the development in this coffee. For whatever reason, it seemed to highlight the better qualities of this one. Day 38 through the V60 with the same adjustments, and there were mixed results as this brew method did seem to yield much more of the more developed qualities, as there's a better defined and pronounced sugary stone fruit this time around with more of that palm fruit brightness. Pretty sugary in general with less of that papery quality, but this trade-off came at the cost of having a little bit more of that smoky tone to it. Day 41, the same adjustments with the Chemex, and I felt like it was possible that this coffee had backtracked ever so slightly, as it didn't feel quite as intense in terms of the overall sugariness, but that would certainly change on day 44, as that was the best results we'd had with this coffee, was brewing it with the higher extraction adjustments on the Chemex. So we went back to that one more time, and it was better yet again. So I do have to say that this coffee at times felt slightly inconsistent, as there's a very interesting trade-off to this coffee, is the roastiness is still a pretty prominent component in it, but it's made up for on the back end with a very high level of sugariness, which once again, it can't seem to be taken away from this coffee no matter what sort of adjustments you make. A pretty well-defined apricot as the stone fruit, and a really prominent sugariness present on the cool down of this one as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a pretty interesting looking tasting wheel, so let's go through this. We have a handful of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4, and even though when it comes to a coffee like this, I might want to save that towards the end, we'll discuss it alongside of the smokiness. There is a slight bit of that roasty quality to it, but again, it's not to the point where I think that it really seemed to hinder the overall experience of this coffee. Outside of that, the fruit aspects in it were well defined and clean enough to justify this being on the higher end in terms of that cleanliness. It's not going to be the highest or cleanest level 4 you're ever going to see from a coffee, but I didn't feel like we could mark it down too much within this one. Finish level 4, there's so much sugariness to it that I can kind of discuss it alongside of the sweetness, which was also there at the level 4. I think they have something along the lines of brown sugar, makes a lot of sense, and I think that's what the papery quality was within this coffee, is sometimes people describe either kiwi or brown sugar, and for me it comes out a little bit papery in a certain sense. So that's what I think I was getting from this coffee. Outside of that, there's enough sugariness within the stone fruit qualities of this coffee, and also that listed pear. I could also see some like that. I would say it was a little bit more presented in the brightness. Even then, very sweet. I've been mentioning that right from the start. Level 4 is certainly justified. I don't think I could push it higher than that, but that's also presented within the finish, a very sugary finish to this coffee. Brightness level 4, that was kind of out of nowhere. I know it's a pink bourbon coffee, and in theory, I might have expected it to score a level 4, but for it to still come out at that level 4, I think that was mostly due to the fact that we really seemed to push this coffee, and I think it helped accentuate those brighter qualities to it. I wouldn't necessarily say that if we kind of stuck to a lower extraction recipe that this coffee would have reached that same level, so I think that's something that could be played around with within this coffee. Stone fruit level 4, I mentioned apricot, abundant, I would say especially towards the end, a little inconsistent within this coffee, but when it was pronounced, I would say that it was one of the better aspects of this coffee. Handful of level 3s, we will start with the florality level 3. I don't necessarily think that there's anything too specific that I could highlight within this one. A little bit more of a honey-like florality that was presented within it from time to time. Given that there was so much sugariness to it, I can also see it in a little bit sweeter of a sense as well. Spice level 3, that's certainly one of the more interesting qualities to it. I don't think that there's any sort of spice note listed on here, but I think that was presented in a little bit more traditional of a sense, given that this is a Colombian coffee. Outside of that, citrus fruit level 3. Another thing that I don't necessarily think I mentioned too much, a bit more on that pear side of things, because that is one of the other notes they have listed on here. That's always the best place I can find to put it within a tasting wheel like this, either pears or apples. So that's where we opted to put it there at that level 3 mark. Caramel level 3, that's going to be attributed to a combination of the sweetness, the brown sugar sweetness that I continuously mentioned. That's the best place I could find to put within this tasting wheel as well. So that's why that's scoring on the higher side of things. And then the final thing worth discussing, body level 3. Pretty interesting, this one being brewed with the Chemex, and given that it's a Colombian coffee, I think it could have probably gone a number of directions, but it still had plenty of body and texture to it. So level 3 is where we opted to put it, and as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one was a little bit of a weird one. I think that it bucked all conventional wisdom, but I was really stumped by this one at the 5th time we brewed it. So I didn't really know which direction to go with it because no matter what I seemed to do, it didn't act the way that I was expecting it to act. So I just threw caution to the wind and decided to see what would happen if we pushed it. And it seemed to work out in a weird way. So for whatever happened with this coffee, I would say it probably turned out better than I was expecting. And given that we have such limited familiarity with Australian-based coffee roasters, I don't know if this is the standard, if this is supposed to be good for an Australian-based coffee. But as far as it goes for me, it hit on a couple of marks that I was looking for. It was pretty sweet. It was relatively clean. It had some nice fruit qualities to it and a little bit of florality. So there were some positives that I did take away. And I wouldn't necessarily say that this is my specific type of coffee, though there were definitely some positives that I did take away from it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, and given just how much this one stumped me and the way that it turned out, I'm not entirely sure that I have a great description for how I would try to describe this coffee, mostly because I haven't really had too many coffees that act in the way that this one did. I would say a little bit more modern traditional because it still has a little bit more of the traditional qualities to it. I mean, it does have a very, we'll say, sugariness to it, plenty of texture and body to it, and a little bit more of a traditional coffee feel, but at the same time, it's mixed with a very high level of sweetness and fruit components. So I think maybe somebody that's trending on the more modern side of a traditional drinker is probably the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Manta, this is actually the only coffee that we're reviewing from them. I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Linarco Rodriguez Palestina wash processed Colombia from Manta Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.